What if the first civilization didn't vanish into dust, but left its fingerprints all around us, hidden in plain sight, waiting for us to notice? Think about it for a moment. Every day, you walk past stone, metal, and earth that has been here longer than any empire you learned about in school. You stand beneath stars that guided ancient navigators across oceans we're only beginning to understand. You speak languages built on roots so old that linguists can only guess at their origins. And somewhere, buried beneath cities and jungles and sand, there might be something older still. Something that came before everything we think we know about the beginning. The story we've been told is simple enough. Humans wandered as hunter-gatherers for hundreds of thousands of years, living in small bands, following herds, gathering what the land offered. Then, around 12,000 years ago, something shifted. Agriculture appeared, villages formed, cities rose, writing emerged, civilization, as we understand it, began. But what if that story is incomplete? What if the rise of civilization wasn't a beginning at all, but a rebuilding? What if the temples we call ancient are actually echoes of something far older? Blueprints copied from memories that stretch back beyond the edge of recorded time. What if the myths we dismiss as fantasy are actually fragments of history, distorted by millennia but still carrying the truth of what once was? Tonight, we're going to walk through the ruins of that possibility. We're going to stand in the places where the past refuses to stay buried, where stone and symbol whisper of something that shouldn't exist according to the timeline we've been given. We're going to ask the questions that archaeology sometimes avoids, not because the answers are impossible, but because they might change everything. And maybe, just maybe, we'll begin to see that the first civilization never truly left us at all. The conventional story of human history is built on layers. Each layer represents an age, a culture, a moment when humanity took another step forward. At the bottom you find the Paleolithic, the old Stone Age, when our ancestors chipped flint into tools and painted animals on cave walls. Above that, the Neolithic, the New Stone Age, when farming began and permanent settlements appeared. Then come the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, and finally the classical civilizations we recognize: Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome. It's a neat progression. It makes sense. It follows a logical path from simplicity to complexity, from survival to sophistication. And for most of the 20th century, this timeline was considered settled. The evidence seemed clear. The dates lined up. The story was complete. But archaeology is a science of discovery, and discovery has a way of unsettling even the most carefully constructed narratives. In 1994, a shepherd named Şafak Yıldız was walking through the hills of southeastern Turkey, near the city of Şanlıurfa, when he noticed something unusual jutting from the earth. It looked like worked stone, carved, deliberate, too regular to be natural. He reported it to local authorities, and soon archaeologists arrived to investigate. What they found shouldn't have been there. Göbekli Tepe. The name means potbelly hill in Turkish, an unassuming title for what would become one of the most important archaeological sites ever discovered. Beneath the soil lay massive stone pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons, arranged in circular formations. The pillars were carved with intricate reliefs: foxes, lions, scorpions, vultures, serpents, rendered with skill and artistry that spoke of a sophisticated culture. But here's what made Göbekli Tepe impossible according to the accepted timeline. It was built around 9600 BCE, possibly earlier. That places it at the very end of the last ice age, in an era when humans were supposed to be nomadic hunter-gatherers, living in small groups, possessing neither the organization nor the technology to construct monumental architecture. Yet there it was, a temple complex covering more than 20 acres, built by people who, according to everything we thought we knew, shouldn't have been capable of such a feat. No evidence of agriculture, no signs of permanent settlement, just the temple itself, rising from the earth like a question carved in stone. The archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who led the excavations for decades, called it a cathedral on a hill. But cathedrals are built by civilizations, by societies with surplus food, specialized labor, hierarchical organization. Göbekli Tepe suggested something else entirely, that perhaps the temple came first and civilization followed, that perhaps the need to gather, to build, to create something sacred was what drove humans to settle down, to farm, to organize themselves into the complex societies we recognize today. But if that's true, then who taught them? Where did the knowledge come from? How did hunter-gatherers, scattered across a harsh landscape, suddenly conceive of architecture, astronomy, and art sophisticated enough to rival anything built thousands of years later? The conventional answer is that they figured it out themselves, that human ingenuity, given the right circumstances, can accomplish anything. And maybe that's true. Maybe Göbekli Tepe is simply evidence of a forgotten genius, a culture that rose and fell before history began to keep records. Or maybe it's evidence of something else. Maybe it's a remnant, a copy, a memory of something older still. The timeline of civilization is marked by sudden appearances. Agriculture doesn't gradually evolve. It erupts in multiple locations around the world within a relatively short span of time. The Fertile Crescent, the Indus Valley, China, Mesoamerica, all develop farming independently, or so we're told, within a few thousand years of each other. Writing appears in Sumer around 3200 BCE, seemingly fully formed, with no clear evolutionary path from simpler systems. Monumental architecture, pyramids, ziggurats, stone circles, springs up across continents, built by cultures that supposedly had no contact with one another. These aren't gradual developments, they're explosions of knowledge, as if someone flipped a switch and humanity suddenly remembered how to build, how to organize, how to create. Mainstream archaeology explains this through independent invention, the idea that humans, facing similar challenges, will develop similar solutions, and there's truth to that. But it doesn't quite account for the precision, the sophistication, the sheer scale of what appears in the archaeological record. Take the Great Pyramid of Giza. Built around 2560 BCE, it stands as one of the most precisely constructed buildings in human history. Its base is level to within fractions of an inch across more than 13 acres. Its sides are aligned almost perfectly to the cardinal directions: north, south, east, west, with an accuracy that wouldn't be matched again until the age of modern surveying equipment. The stones, some weighing up to 80 tons, are fitted together so tightly that you can't slip a blade between them. And this is supposedly one of the earliest examples of monumental architecture in Egypt. There's no clear progression leading up to it, no series of increasingly sophisticated pyramids showing how the Egyptians learned to build on such a scale. The Great Pyramid simply appears, fully realized, as if the knowledge required to construct it was already present, waiting to be applied. The conventional explanation is that the Egyptians were brilliant engineers who developed their techniques through trial and error, building smaller structures that have since been lost or destroyed. And again, maybe that's true. But it requires us to believe that an enormous amount of experimentation and failure has simply vanished from the record, leaving only the triumphs behind. Or maybe the knowledge didn't need to be developed. Maybe it was inherited. The ancient Egyptians themselves believed their civilization was a legacy. Their texts speak of the Zep Tepi, the first time, an age of gods and divine kings who ruled before the pharaohs, who brought knowledge and order to the land. They spoke of Thoth, the god of wisdom, who gave them writing, mathematics, and astronomy. They spoke of a golden age that existed before the floods, before the chaos, before the world as they knew it began. We call these myths, stories, metaphors for natural forces or political ideologies. But what if they're memories? What if the Egyptians were describing something real? A civilization that existed before theirs, whose knowledge they inherited and preserved. The idea sounds fantastical, but the evidence keeps appearing scattered across the globe, refusing to fit neatly into the timeline we've constructed. In the 1990s, a geologist named Robert Schoch stood before the Great Sphinx of Giza and saw something that didn't make sense. The Sphinx, carved from a single outcrop of limestone, bears the unmistakable marks of water erosion, deep vertical fissures running down its body, the kind of weathering caused by prolonged exposure to heavy rainfall. But here's the problem. The Sphinx sits in the middle of the Sahara Desert, one of the driest places on Earth. The last time the region experienced rainfall heavy enough to cause that kind of erosion was at the end of the last ice age, around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, thousands of years before the Egyptians are supposed to have built the Sphinx. Schoch's conclusion was controversial. The Sphinx is far older than we think. It might have been carved during a time when the Sahara was still green, when rivers flowed and rain fell regularly, when the climate was entirely different from what it is today. Egyptologists rejected the theory almost immediately. The Sphinx, they argued, was built during the rise of Pharaoh Khafra around 2500 BCE, and the erosion could be explained by wind, sand, and other factors. But Schoch stood by his analysis. As a geologist, he knew erosion, and the erosion on the Sphinx was caused by water, not wind. If he's right, then the Sphinx predates the Egyptian civilization by thousands of years. It would mean that the monument we associate with the pharaohs was actually inherited from an earlier culture, one that existed before the deserts formed, before the Nile settled into its current course, before the world we recognize came into being, and the Sphinx wouldn't be alone. Across the Mediterranean, on the island of Malta, stand the megalithic temples of Gantija, Hagar Kim, and Mnajdra. These structures, built from massive limestone blocks, some weighing over 50 tons, date back to around 3600 BCE. Older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids. The temples are aligned with astronomical precision, their entrances oriented to capture the light of the solstices and equinoxes. Inside you find altars, carvings, and evidence of ritual activity that speaks of a sophisticated religious culture. But who built them? The islands of Malta were sparsely populated during the Neolithic period, home to small farming communities with limited resources. How did they quarry, transport, and erect stones of such immense size? How did they acquire the astronomical knowledge necessary to align the temples with such precision? The local legends offer an answer, though it's one that archaeology dismisses. The temples, the stories say, were built by giants, beings of immense strength who moved the stones as easily as humans move pebbles. The name Gantyjar itself means giant's tower. We call these legends folklore. But what if they're descriptions? What if the people of Malta were trying to explain something they didn't fully understand? A legacy left by a culture so advanced, so powerful, that they seemed like giants in comparison. The ocean hides more than we know. Beneath the waves, beyond the reach of casual exploration, lie landscapes that were once dry land, coastlines, valleys, plains that existed during the Ice Age, when sea levels were hundreds of feet lower than they are today. As the ice melted and the waters rose, these lands were swallowed, and with them, any evidence of the people who might have lived there. In 1985, a dive instructor named Kihachiro Aratake was exploring the waters off the coast of Yonaguni, the westernmost island of Japan, when he discovered something extraordinary. Beneath the surface, carved into the bedrock, lay what appeared to be a massive stone structure. Terraces, steps, platforms, and walls arranged in geometric patterns. The formation, now known as the Yonaguni Monument, stretches for more than 100 metres and rises nearly 30 metres from the seafloor. The question that immediately arose was simple. Is it natural, or was it made by human hands? Geologists who examined the site were divided. Some argued that the formations were the result of natural erosion, that the straight edges and right angles were simply the product of the eye of the rock fractured along its natural planes. Others, including marine geologist Masaki Kimura, who has studied the site extensively, believe the monument shows clear signs of human modification, tool marks, carvings, and architectural features that couldn't have been created by nature alone. If Kimura is right, then the Yonaguni Monument was built during the last ice age, when the area was above water. That would place its construction at least 10,000 years ago, making it one of the oldest human-made structures on Earth. But who built it? The conventional history of Japan doesn't include advanced civilizations during that period. The Jomon culture, known for its pottery and small settlements, wouldn't emerge until thousands of years later. If the monument is real, it suggests the presence of a culture we don't know about, one that possessed the knowledge and organization to create monumental architecture long before any known civilization in the region. And Yonaguni isn't alone. Off the coast of India, near the city of Dwarka in the state of Gujarat, lie the submerged ruins of what appears to be an ancient city. Discovered in the 1980s by marine archaeologists, the site includes stone structures, walls and artifacts that date back thousands of years. According to Hindu tradition, Dwarka was the legendary city of Lord Krishna, a golden metropolis that sank into the sea after his death. For centuries the story was considered myth, but the discovery of the underwater ruins suggests that Dwarka was real, that a city once stood on the coast, thriving and prosperous, before the sea claimed it. How old is it? The dating is uncertain, but some estimates place the ruins at over 9,000 years old, far older than the earliest known cities in the Indus Valley. If true, it would mean that urban civilization in India predates everything we thought we knew about the region's history. And then there's the question of what else lies beneath the waves. The coastlines of the Ice Age are now submerged under hundreds of feet of water, inaccessible to all but the most advanced underwater exploration. How many other cities, temples, and monuments are hidden down there waiting to be found? How much of human history has been erased by the rising seas? The myths remember the flood. Almost every culture on Earth has a story about it. A time when the waters rose and the world was drowned, when only a few survived to rebuild. The Bible tells of Noah and the Ark. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes Utnapishtim, who built a boat to survive the deluge sent by the gods. Hindu texts speak of Manu, who was warned by a fish to build a vessel before the great flood came. The Greeks had Deucalion, the Chinese had Gunyu, the Aztecs had Coxcoxtli. These stories span continents and millennia, yet they share the same core: a catastrophic flood, a chosen survivor, a new beginning. Mainstream scholarship explains these myths as cultural memories of local floods, rivers overflowing, tsunamis striking coastal regions, natural disasters that were so devastating they became embedded in the collective memory. And there's truth to that. Floods happen. They're terrifying. They destroy everything in their path. It makes sense that ancient peoples would remember them and weave them into their mythology. But what if the myths are describing something bigger? What if they're all remembering the same event, a global catastrophe that reshaped the world and wiped out whatever came before? At the end of the last ice age, around 11,600 years ago, the Earth underwent a dramatic transformation. The ice sheets that had covered much of the northern hemisphere began to melt, releasing unimaginable quantities of water into the oceans. Sea levels rose by more than 300 feet, drowning coastlines, flooding river valleys, and submerging vast stretches of land that had been inhabited for thousands of years. This wasn't a gradual process. Evidence suggests that the melting happened in pulses, sudden, catastrophic events that would have seemed apocalyptic to anyone living through them. Entire landscapes disappeared beneath the waves within a matter of decades, perhaps even years. Communities that had existed for generations were forced to flee inland, abandoning their homes, their temples, their history. If a civilization existed during the Ice Age, a culture that thrived on the now submerged coastlines, that built cities and monuments in the fertile lowlands, it would have been obliterated by the rising seas. And the survivors, scattered and traumatized, would have carried the memory of that catastrophe with them, passing it down through stories, myths, and legends. Is that what the flood myths are? Echoes of a real event, distorted by time but still carrying the truth of what happened. The idea is compelling, but it raises another question. If a civilization was destroyed by the flood, what happened to its knowledge? Did it vanish with the cities, lost beneath the waves? Or did the survivors carry it with them, preserving it in the cultures that came after? The ancient world is filled with teachers, figures who appear in myths and legends, bringing knowledge to humanity, showing them how to farm, how to build, how to read the stars. The Egyptians had Thoth. The Sumerians had the Apkallu, 7 sages who emerged from the sea to teach civilization to mankind. The Mayans spoke of Kukulkan, the feathered serpent who brought wisdom and culture. The Incas revered Viracocha, the creator god who travelled the land, instructing people in the arts of civilization. These beings are described as gods, but their actions are strangely practical. They don't just perform miracles, they teach. They show humans how to plant crops, how to construct buildings, how to organize societies. They're described as wise, ancient, and often as coming from somewhere else, across the sea, from the sky, from a distant land that no longer exists. We interpret these stories as mythology, as personifications of natural forces or cultural heroes elevated to divine status. But what if they're descriptions of real people? What if the gods were survivors of the lost civilization, carrying the knowledge of the old world into the new? Imagine it. The flood has come. The cities are gone. The coastlines have vanished beneath the waves. But some survived. A remnant of the old culture, possessing knowledge that the scattered hunter-gatherers of the post-flood world don't have. They know agriculture, they know architecture, they know astronomy, mathematics, engineering, and they travel, moving from region to region, teaching the people they encounter, helping them rebuild. To the people receiving this knowledge, these survivors would seem like gods. They would possess abilities and understanding far beyond anything the locals had ever seen. They would be remembered, revered, woven into the mythology of every culture they touched. And maybe that's what the myths are describing. Not gods, but teachers. Not magic, but knowledge. Not fantasy, but history. The idea is speculative, of course. There's no direct evidence of a global civilization that predates the known cultures of antiquity. But the patterns are there, the shared myths, the sudden appearances of advanced knowledge, the monuments that seem too sophisticated for their supposed age. And the more we look, the more the pieces seem to fit together. Göbekli Tepe isn't the only site that challenges the timeline. In 2013, archaeologists working in southern Turkey discovered another ancient complex, this one called Karahan Tepe. Like Göbekli Tepe, it features massive stone pillars carved with intricate reliefs, arranged in circular formations. And like Göbekli Tepe, it dates back to the end of the Ice Age, to a time when such structures shouldn't exist. But Karahan Tepe is different in one crucial way. It's carved directly into the bedrock. The entire complex is subterranean, hollowed out of the living stone, with chambers, passageways, and pillars all cut from the same piece of rock. The effort required to create such a site is staggering. It would have taken years, perhaps decades of continuous labour, all without metal tools, without wheels, without any of the technology we associate with advanced construction. Why would a nomadic people invest so much time and energy into creating something like this? What purpose did it serve, and how did they know how to do it? The conventional answer is that we're underestimating the capabilities of Neolithic peoples, that they were far more organised, far more skilled than we've given them credit for. And maybe that's true, but it still doesn't explain where the knowledge came from. Architecture isn't instinctive, it's learned. Someone had to teach them, or they had to learn from someone else. Or maybe they were copying something. Maybe they were recreating structures they had seen before, or heard about, or remembered from stories passed down through generations. In Peru, high in the Andes Mountains, stands the fortress of Sacsayhuaman, overlooking the city of Cusco. The walls of Sacsayhuaman are built from massive stones, some weighing over 200 tons, fitted together with such precision that the joints are nearly invisible. No mortar was used. The stones simply lock together, held in place by their own weight and the perfection of their fit. The Inca, who controlled the region when the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, claimed they didn't build Sacsayhuaman. According to their legends, the fortress was constructed by an earlier people, a race of giants or gods who possessed knowledge the Inca themselves didn't have. The Inca used the site, maintained it, even added to it, but the original construction, they said, was far older. Modern archaeology dates Sacsayhuaman to around the 15th century, attributing it to the Inca Empire at the height of its power. But the dating is based on the assumption that the Inca built it, not on direct evidence from the stones themselves. And the Inca's own accounts suggest otherwise. What if they were telling the truth? What if Sacsayhuaman, like the Sphinx, like Göbekli Tepe, is a remnant of something older, a structure built by a forgotten culture and later claimed by those who came after? The same question applies to other megalithic sites around the world. Stonehenge in England, the stone circles of Karnak in France, the Moai of Easter Island, the temples of Angkor Wat in Cambodia. All of them display a level of sophistication, a mastery of engineering and astronomy that seems to exceed what we'd expect from the cultures that supposedly built them. And all of them, in their own way, seem to be pointing toward something. Not just toward the sky, though many are aligned with celestial events, but toward a shared knowledge, a common understanding that transcends geography and time. The alignment of ancient sites has fascinated researchers for decades. Stonehenge is aligned with the summer solstice. The Great Pyramid is aligned with the cardinal directions, and some argue with the constellation Orion. The temples of Angkor Wat mirror the stars of Draco. The Nazca lines in Peru depict animals and geometric shapes visible only from the air, their purpose still unknown. These aren't random placements, they're deliberate. They reflect an understanding of astronomy, geometry and mathematics that required careful observation and precise calculation. But why? What was the purpose of encoding this knowledge into stone? One theory is that these sites served as calendars, marking the passage of seasons and helping agricultural societies plan their planting and harvesting. That makes sense for some structures, but it doesn't explain the sheer scale and complexity of others. You don't need a pyramid the size of a mountain to track the solstices. You don't need massive stone circles or subterranean temples. A few markers, a simple observatory would suffice, unless the purpose was something more, unless these sites were meant to preserve knowledge, to encode information in a form that would survive the ages. Stone doesn't decay. It doesn't burn. It can withstand floods, earthquakes, the slow erosion of time. If you wanted to leave a message for the future, stone would be the perfect medium. But what message? And for whom? Some researchers have suggested that the alignments of ancient sites form a global pattern, a network of monuments connected by geometry and astronomy. The idea is controversial, dismissed by mainstream archaeology as coincidence or wishful thinking, but the patterns are there. The Great Pyramid, the ancient city of Petra, the temples of Angkor Wat, and the Moai of Easter Island all lie along lines of latitude and longitude that seem too precise to be accidental. If these sites are connected, it would suggest a level of coordination, a shared knowledge that spanned continents. It would mean that the cultures who built them were in contact, or that they inherited their knowledge from a common source. Or maybe the sites themselves are the message. Maybe they're markers, pointing towards something we haven't found yet. Maybe they're pieces of a puzzle, scattered across the globe, waiting for us to put them together. The deeper we look, the more the past begins to look back. Every discovery raises new questions. Every answer leads to another mystery. And the more we learn about the ancient world, the more we realize how much we don't know. In the 1960s, a professor of history named Charles Hapgood proposed a theory that would become one of the most controversial ideas in alternative archaeology. Hapgood had been studying old maps, portolans and sea charts created during the age of exploration, and he noticed something strange. Some of these maps showed coastlines and geographical features with a level of accuracy that shouldn't have been possible, given the technology of the time. The most famous example is the Piri Reis map, created in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis. The map shows the coast of South America, the Atlantic Ocean, and, most intriguingly, what appears to be the coastline of Antarctica. But here's the problem. Antarctica wasn't officially discovered until 1820, more than 300 years after the map was drawn. And the coastline depicted on the Piri Reis map doesn't show the ice-covered continent we know today. It shows the land beneath the ice, the actual shape of the continent as it would appear if the ice sheets were removed. How is that possible? How could a 16th century cartographer have known what Antarctica looked like beneath the ice? Piri Reis himself provided an answer, though it's one that raises more questions than it solves. In notes on the map, he explained that he had compiled it from older sources, ancient charts that had been passed down through the centuries, some dating back to the time of Alexander the Great or earlier. He was, in essence, copying maps that already existed, maps created by people who had explored and charted the world long before his time. If that's true, it means that someone at some point in the distant past had the knowledge and technology to accurately map the Earth, including regions that were supposedly unknown to ancient civilizations. It means that the world was explored, surveyed, and documented long before the age of exploration, and that this knowledge was preserved and passed down through the centuries. Hapgood took the idea further. He suggested that the ancient maps were evidence of a lost civilization, a culture that existed during the Ice Age, when Antarctica was free of ice, and that possessed advanced knowledge of geography, navigation, and cartography. This civilization, he argued, was destroyed by a cataclysm, but its maps survived, copied and recopied by later cultures who didn't fully understand what they were preserving. The theory was met with skepticism, and rightly so. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the Piri Reis map alone isn't enough to prove the existence of a lost civilization. But it's hard to ignore the questions it raises. How did ancient peoples acquire such detailed geographical knowledge? Where did the information come from? And why does it seem to depict a world that no longer exists? The idea of a lost civilization isn't new. It's been part of human mythology for thousands of years, woven into the stories we tell about our origins. Plato wrote about Atlantis, a powerful island nation that sank into the sea after angering the gods. Hindu texts describe Kumari Kandam, a sunken continent that once connected India to Australia. The Hopi people of North America speak of previous worlds that were destroyed, each one giving way to the next in a cycle of creation and destruction. These stories are usually dismissed as allegory, as moral tales or religious metaphors. But what if they're based on something real? What if the memory of a lost civilization is so deeply embedded in human culture that it appears in the mythology of every society, regardless of geography or time period. The end of the Ice Age was a time of unimaginable upheaval. The climate shifted, the ice melted, the seas rose, entire ecosystems were transformed, and humanity scattered across the globe had to adapt or perish. It's not hard to imagine that a civilization existing during that time would have been devastated, its cities drowned, its people scattered, its knowledge fragmented. But some of that knowledge might have survived, carried by refugees, preserved in oral traditions, encoded in myths and symbols. And as the survivors integrated into the emerging cultures of the post-flood world, they would have brought their knowledge with them, teaching the people they encountered, helping them rebuild. Over time, the memory of the original civilization would fade. The teachers would become gods. The cities would become legends. The knowledge would be attributed to divine revelation rather than human ingenuity. But the core of the story would remain, passed down through generations, waiting for someone to recognize it for what it is. In the deserts of Egypt, beneath the sands of Abydos, lies a temple dedicated to the pharaoh Seti I. The temple is famous for its intricate carvings, its beautifully preserved hieroglyphs, and its depiction of the Abydos king list, a chronological record of the pharaohs who ruled Egypt. But there's something else in the temple, something that has sparked endless debate and speculation. On one of the walls, high above the floor, is a section of hieroglyphs that appears to show modern technology, helicopters, airplanes, submarines. The images are clear, unmistakable, and utterly impossible according to the conventional timeline. Egyptologists have a straightforward explanation. The images are the result of pareidolia, the human tendency to see patterns and familiar shapes in random or ambiguous stimuli. The helicopter and airplane are actually overlapping hieroglyphs carved at different times that happen to resemble modern vehicles when viewed from a certain angle. It's a coincidence, nothing more, and maybe that's true. Maybe we're seeing what we want to see, projecting our own knowledge onto ancient symbols that mean something entirely different. But the images are striking, and they're not the only examples of ancient art that seems to depict advanced technology. In the Temple of Dendera, also in Egypt, there's a relief that appears to show a large bulbous object connected to a cable, held by figures in what looks like a ritualistic pose. Some researchers have suggested that the image depicts an ancient light bulb powered by electricity. Mainstream archaeology dismisses the idea, explaining the relief as a symbolic representation of a lotus flower or a mythological scene. But the resemblance to modern technology is undeniable. In India, the ancient Sanskrit texts known as the Vedas describe flying machines called vimanas, capable of travelling great distances and even engaging in aerial combat. The descriptions are detailed, including specifications for construction, fuel, and operation. Are these purely mythological, or are they describing something real? Technology that existed in the distant past and was later lost? The Baghdad battery, discovered in Iraq in the 1930s, is a clay jar containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod, arranged in a way that could theoretically generate an electric current if filled with an acidic liquid. Some researchers believe it's evidence of ancient electrical knowledge. Others argue it was used for electroplating or as a storage vessel for sacred scrolls. The debate continues. These anomalies don't prove the existence of a lost civilization. They're ambiguous, open to interpretation, and often dismissed as misidentifications or hoaxes. But they keep appearing, and they keep raising the same question. What if the ancients knew more than we think? The mathematics of the ancient world are astonishing. The Egyptians understood geometry well enough to construct the pyramids with near-perfect precision. The Babylonians developed a sophisticated system of astronomy, tracking the movements of the planets and predicting eclipses. The Mayans created a calendar so accurate that it rivals modern timekeeping. But where did this knowledge come from? Mathematics isn't intuitive, it's abstract, requiring years of study and experimentation to develop. Yet it appears in the ancient world fully formed, as if it was already understood. The Great Pyramid encodes mathematical constants that wouldn't be discovered until thousands of years later. The ratio of its height to its base perimeter is approximately equal to the ratio of a circle's radius to its circumference. In other words, it encodes the value of pi. The pyramid's dimensions also relate to the golden ratio, a mathematical constant that appears throughout nature and art. Were the Egyptians aware of these relationships? Did they intentionally encode them into the pyramid's design? Or are they coincidences, the result of using simple ratios that happen to approximate these constants? The same questions apply to other ancient structures. Stonehenge incorporates geometric principles that suggest an understanding of Pythagorean triangles, centuries before Pythagoras was born. The temples of Angkor Wat are laid out according to precise mathematical ratios that mirror the structure of the cosmos as described in Hindu cosmology. It's possible that ancient peoples discovered these principles independently through observation and experimentation, but it's also possible that they inherited them, that the knowledge was passed down from an earlier source, preserved and applied by cultures that didn't fully understand its origins. The symbols are everywhere, spirals carved into stone, labyrinths etched into cave walls, geometric patterns repeated across continents. They appear in Ireland, in Malta, in the American Southwest, in Australia. They're found in cultures that had no contact with one another, separated by oceans and millennia. Yet they use the same symbols, the same designs, the same visual language. What do they mean? Are they religious symbols, representations of gods or cosmic forces? Are they maps, encoding geographical or astronomical information? Are they simply decorative, the product of a universal human aesthetic? Or are they something else? Are they a language, a system of communication that transcends words, that can be understood by anyone, anywhere, regardless of culture or time period? The spiral is one of the most common symbols in ancient art. It appears in Neolithic carvings, in Celtic designs, in Native American petroglyphs. It's found on pottery, on monuments, on the walls of tombs. Some researchers believe it represents the cycle of life and death, the eternal return. Others suggest it's a symbol of the sun, or the movement of the stars, or the structure of the cosmos itself. But maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe the spiral is a memory, a symbol passed down from the first civilization, carried by the survivors, preserved in the art and architecture of every culture that came after. A reminder that we're all connected, that we all share the same origin, that the knowledge of the past is still with us, waiting to be recognized. The question of contact haunts archaeology. How did cultures separated by vast distances develop similar technologies, similar symbols, similar myths? The conventional answer is independent invention. that humans, facing similar challenges, will develop similar solutions, and there's truth to that. But it doesn't explain everything. The pyramids of Egypt and the pyramids of Mesoamerica are strikingly similar, despite being built by cultures that supposedly had no contact. Both are massive stone structures, built as tombs or temples, aligned with astronomical precision. Both required immense labour and sophisticated engineering. Both reflect a deep understanding of mathematics and geometry. Is this coincidence? Or is it evidence of a shared knowledge, a common source that influenced both cultures? The same question applies to the flood myths, the symbols, the astronomical alignments. The patterns are too consistent, too widespread to be easily dismissed. They suggest a connection, a thread that runs through human history, linking cultures across time and space. Maybe that thread is the first civilization. Maybe the knowledge they possessed was so fundamental, so universal, that it became embedded in every culture that followed. Maybe they didn't just leave monuments and myths. They left a blueprint, a template for civilization itself, encoded in the structures and symbols that still surround us today. The ocean floor is the least explored place on Earth. We've mapped more of the surface of Mars than we have of the deep sea. And beneath those dark waters, hidden under sediment and time, might lie the answers to the questions we've been asking. In 2001, a team of researchers using sonar equipment off the coast of Cuba detected what appeared to be a series of geometric structures on the ocean floor, more than 2,000 feet below the surface. The sonar images showed what looked like pyramids, roads, and buildings, arranged in a pattern that suggested urban planning. The discovery was met with excitement and skepticism. Some researchers believed it could be evidence of a sunken city, possibly dating back to the Ice Age when sea levels were lower. Others argued that the formations were natural, the result of geological processes rather than human construction. Further exploration was planned, but funding dried up, and the site remains largely uninvestigated. The structures, if they exist, are still down there, waiting beneath the waves. And they're not alone. Sonar surveys have detected anomalies on the ocean floor around the world. Formations that look too regular, too geometric, to be natural. Most are dismissed as geological features, misinterpretations of sonar data or wishful thinking. But some remain unexplained. What if the ocean is hiding the evidence we've been looking for? What if the cities of the first civilization are down there, submerged beneath hundreds of feet of water, preserved in the cold, dark depths where time moves slowly and decay is held at bay? We may never know. The ocean is vast, and the technology required to explore it thoroughly is expensive and difficult to deploy. But the possibility remains, and every so often, a diver or a sonar operator catches a glimpse of something that shouldn't be there. A wall, a column, a structure that looks too deliberate to be natural, and the questions come flooding back. The myths speak of teachers, but they also speak of warnings. The stories of Atlantis, of Kumarikandam, of the previous worlds destroyed by the gods. They're not just tales of loss. They're cautionary tales, reminders of what happens when civilizations grow too proud, too powerful, too disconnected from the natural world. Plato's account of Atlantis describes a society that began as a utopia, blessed by the gods, prosperous and wise. But over time, the Atlanteans became corrupt, greedy, obsessed with conquest and power, and so the gods punished them, sending earthquakes and floods that swallowed the island in a single day and night. The story is often read as a moral allegory, a warning against hubris and excess. But what if it's also a memory? What if Plato was describing a real civilization, one that rose to great heights and then fell, destroyed by natural disasters or its own mistakes? The end of the Ice Age was a time of catastrophe. The melting ice caused massive flooding. The climate shifted rapidly, destabilizing ecosystems and forcing populations to migrate. Volcanic eruptions, earthquakes and tsunamis would have been common as the Earth's crust adjusted to the changing weight of the ice sheets. If a civilization existed during that time, it would have been vulnerable. A single catastrophic event, a massive flood, a volcanic eruption, a sudden shift in climate, could have wiped it out, leaving only scattered survivors and fragmented memories. And maybe that's the warning encoded in the myths. Not just that civilizations can fall, but that they have fallen before. That we're not the first to reach this level of complexity, this level of power, and that if we're not careful, we won't be the last. The idea of cyclical history is ancient. The Greeks believed in the concept of the great year, a cycle of creation and destruction that repeats endlessly. Hindu cosmology describes yugas, vast ages of time during which the world rises and falls, each cycle ending in dissolution before beginning anew. The Mayans believed in a series of world ages, each one ending in catastrophe before the next begins. These aren't linear histories, they're cycles. They suggest that civilization isn't a one-time achievement, but a recurring phenomenon, that humanity has risen before, and fallen, and risen again, over and over across the ages. Modern science doesn't support this view. The archaeological record shows a clear progression from simple to complex, from hunter-gatherers to agricultural societies to urban civilizations. There's no evidence of advanced civilizations existing before the known cultures of antiquity. But the archaeological record is incomplete. It's biased toward what survives. Stone, pottery, metal, organic materials decay, wood rots, textiles disintegrate, and anything built on the coastlines of the Ice Age is now underwater, beyond the reach of most archaeological surveys. What if the evidence is there, but we haven't found it yet? What if the first civilization left traces that we're only beginning to recognize? Not in the form of cities and monuments, but in the knowledge they passed down, the symbols they encoded, the myths they left behind. The stars have always guided us. Long before GPS, before compasses, before maps, humans navigated by the sky. The stars were constant, reliable, a source of knowledge that transcended language and culture, and the ancients understood them in ways we're only beginning to appreciate. The Dogon people of Mali possess astronomical knowledge that seems impossible for a pre-industrial society. They describe Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, as part of a binary system, a claim that wasn't confirmed by modern astronomy until the mid-20th century, when telescopes powerful enough to detect Sirius B were developed. The Dogon also described the orbital period of Sirius B with remarkable accuracy, despite having no telescopes or advanced instruments. How did they know? The conventional explanation is that they learned it from Western astronomers who visited the region in the early 20th century. But the Dogon insist that the knowledge is ancient, passed down through their oral traditions for generations. They also tell a story about where the knowledge came from, a According to their mythology, they were visited long ago by beings called the Nommo, who came from the star system of Sirius and taught them about the cosmos. The Nommo are described as amphibious, living in water and possessing great wisdom. We interpret this as mythology, as a symbolic representation of cultural contact or natural phenomena. But what if the Dogon are describing something real? Not extraterrestrial visitors, necessarily, but teachers, survivors of a lost civilization who possessed advanced astronomical knowledge and travelled the world, sharing what they knew. The same pattern appears in other cultures. The Sumerians described the Apkallu as coming from the sea. The Egyptians said Thoth brought knowledge from a distant land. The Mayans spoke of Kukulkan arriving from across the ocean. All of them described teachers who came from elsewhere, who possessed knowledge that the local people didn't have, and who left after imparting their wisdom. Maybe these stories are describing the same people. Maybe the survivors of the first civilization didn't settle in one place, but travelled, moving from region to region, teaching whoever would listen, preserving their knowledge in the cultures they touched. And maybe the stars were their guide. Maybe they used the same astronomical knowledge that we're only now rediscovering, navigating by the constellations, encoding their understanding of the cosmos into the monuments they helped build. The question of why haunts every mystery. Why would a lost civilization encode knowledge into stone? Why would they align monuments with the stars? Why would they leave symbols and myths scattered across the globe? One possibility is that they were trying to preserve something. If they knew their world was ending, if they saw the ice melting, the seas rising, the climate shifting, they might have tried to save what they could, not by building ships or fleeing to higher ground, but by encoding their knowledge in a form that would survive the catastrophe. Stone is eternal. It doesn't burn, doesn't rot, doesn't fade. A message carved into stone can last for thousands of years, waiting for someone to find it, to read it, to understand it. And if you align that stone with the stars, you create a calendar, a clock that marks the passage of time and ensures that the knowledge remains relevant no matter how many centuries pass. Maybe that's what the monuments are. Not temples, not tombs, but time capsules. Messages from the past, encoded in geometry and astronomy, waiting for a future civilization to reach the level of understanding necessary to decode them. And maybe we're finally reaching that level. Maybe the reason we're starting to see the patterns, to recognize the anomalies, to ask the questions, is because we're ready. Because we've developed the tools and the knowledge necessary to understand what the first civilization was trying to tell us. Or maybe the monuments aren't messages at all. Maybe they're markers, signposts pointing towards something we haven't found yet. A library, perhaps, hidden somewhere, waiting to be discovered. A vault of knowledge, preserved and protected, containing the accumulated wisdom of a civilization that knew it was about to disappear. The idea sounds like science fiction, but the ancient world is full of stories about hidden knowledge, secret chambers, lost libraries. The Library of Alexandria, destroyed by fire, supposedly contained the collected knowledge of the ancient world. The Hall of Records, rumoured to lie beneath the Sphinx, is said to contain the history of a lost civilization. The Akashic records, described in esoteric traditions, are believed to be a cosmic repository of all human knowledge and experience. Are these just myths? Or are they memories of something real, distorted by time but still pointing toward the truth? The deeper we go, the more the boundaries blur. History becomes myth. Myth becomes memory. Memory becomes knowledge. And knowledge, encoded in stone and symbol and story, waits for us to recognize it. The first civilization, if it existed, didn't leave us ruins. It left us a legacy. Not in the form of cities or monuments, though these might exist, hidden beneath the waves or buried under the sands, but in the form of knowledge, ideas, principles, understandings that were so fundamental, so universal, that they became part of every culture that followed. Agriculture, architecture, astronomy, mathematics, language, art. These aren't inventions, they're inheritances. They're the gifts of those who came before, passed down through generations, adapted and refined, but never truly forgotten. And maybe that's the real message. Maybe the first civilization isn't lost at all. Maybe it's still here, woven into the fabric of our world, present in every temple, every symbol, every story we tell about where we came from. Maybe we're not searching for a lost civilization. Maybe we're searching for ourselves, for the part of us that remembers, that knows, that carries the knowledge of the past even when we don't realize it. The night is deep now, the stars are bright, and somewhere, beneath the earth or beneath the waves, the past is waiting, not to be discovered, but to be remembered. Not to be excavated, but to be recognized. Because the first civilization didn't vanish. It transformed. It became us. And the clues it left behind aren't hidden in distant ruins or forgotten texts. They're all around us, in the structures we build, the symbols we use, the stories we tell. We walk past them every day. We stand on them. We live within them. And maybe, if we're quiet enough, if we listen closely enough, we can hear them whispering, not in words, but in the language of stone and star and story, the language of those who came before, who knew that the world would change, that civilizations would rise and fall, but that knowledge once given can never truly be lost. It only waits, patient, eternal, encoded in the very bones of the world, and maybe that's the greatest mystery of all. Not whether the first civilization existed, but whether we'll ever truly understand what they were trying to tell us, whether we'll recognize the fingerprints they left behind, whether we'll see that the clues aren't hidden at all. They're everywhere. They always have been. We just have to remember how to see them. But seeing requires more than eyes. It requires a willingness to question what we think we know, to look at the familiar and recognize the impossible. Take Damascus steel. For centuries, blades forged in the Middle East possessed properties that modern metallurgy struggled to replicate. The steel was stronger, more flexible, held a sharper edge. Under a microscope, the metal reveals structures, carbon nanotubes and cementite nanowires, that weren't discovered by material science until the late 20th century. The technique was lost, the knowledge vanished, and for generations we couldn't figure out how medieval smiths had achieved what our laboratories could barely reproduce. What if they didn't invent it? What if they inherited it? The same question haunts Roman concrete. 2,000 years later, Roman harbour installations still stand, still resist the corrosive power of seawater. Modern concrete crumbles in decades under the same conditions. We've analysed the composition, volcanic ash, lime, seawater, a precise chemical reaction. But knowing the ingredients isn't the same as understanding the knowledge system that produced them. The Romans wrote about their concrete. They left instructions. But those instructions assume a foundation of understanding, a context of knowledge that may have been older than Rome itself. Maybe the Romans were remembering something, preserving something, passing down a fragment of material science that originated somewhere else, sometime earlier in a world we've forgotten. And then there's the drilling, the precision drilling. In Egypt, in Peru, in India, ancient stoneworkers created holes in granite and diorite, some of the hardest stones on earth, with a precision that defies explanation. Perfectly circular drill holes, some several feet deep, with spiral grooves that suggest a feed rate faster than modern drills using diamond-tipped bits. Christopher Dunn, a precision engineer, analysed these holes and concluded that the feed rate would require enormous pressure and advanced drill bits. The conventional explanation, copper tools and sand abrasive, doesn't account for the speed, the precision, the uniformity. So what does? At the unfinished obelisk in Aswan, Egypt, trenches cut into bedrock show tool marks that run in parallel lines, perfectly spaced, as if cut by a machine. In Peru, at Sacsayhuaman and Ollantaytambo, stones weighing hundreds of tons are fitted together with tolerances measured in fractions of a millimetre. No mortar, no gaps. Just stone against stone, so precisely cut that you can't slide a piece of paper between them. We're told they used harder stones to pound softer stones, that they used bronze chisels and patience, that time and labour explain everything. But do they? Can they? Or are we looking at the remnants of a technology we don't recognise because it doesn't fit our narrative of linear progress? Listen to the stones, not with your ears, but with your body. In the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid, the granite walls resonate at a frequency that matches the human heartbeat. Stand in the centre and speak, and the sound doesn't echo. It amplifies. It vibrates, it moves through you. At the Hypogeum of Halsaflieni in Malta, a subterranean temple carved from solid limestone, there's a chamber called the Oracle Room. Speak into it at a frequency around 110 Hz, and the sound resonates through the entire structure. That specific frequency affects human brain activity. It alters consciousness, induces trance states, changes the way we perceive reality. Coincidence or design? At Chichen Itza, clap your hands at the base of the pyramid and the echo sounds like the call of the Quetzal bird, sacred to the Maya. At Newgrange in Ireland, the inner chamber resonates at frequencies that enhance male voices while dampening female ones. A feature that seems deliberately engineered into the architecture. These aren't accidents. These are acoustic instruments built from stone. Temples designed not just for ritual, but for sound, for resonance, for the manipulation of human consciousness through frequency. Who taught them? How did they know? The mathematics of acoustics, the physics of resonance, the relationship between frequency and consciousness. These aren't intuitive discoveries. They require experimentation, measurement, understanding. They require a knowledge base that we assume didn't exist. But the stones remember. They still sing. And if we listen, we might hear something older than history. In 1901, divers recovered a corroded lump of bronze from a Roman-era shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera. For decades, it sat in a museum, unexamined, unremarkable. Then someone looked closer. Inside, the corrosion were gears, dozens of them, precisely cut, carefully arranged, forming a mechanism of stunning complexity. When researchers finally reconstructed its function, they discovered an analog computer, a device that could predict the positions of the sun, moon, and planets, calculate eclipses, track the Olympic Games, model the irregular orbit of the moon. It dates to around 100 BCE. Nothing remotely comparable appears as the historical record for another 1,000 years. The Antikythera mechanism isn't just advanced for its time, it's impossible for its time. The precision of the gears, the sophistication of the mathematics, the astronomical knowledge encoded in its function, all of it suggests a tradition of mechanical engineering and scientific understanding that has no context, no precedent, no explanation. We found one device, preserved by accident, recovered by chance. How many didn't survive? How many were melted down, lost, forgotten? How much knowledge vanished because we stopped building the mechanisms, stopped teaching the mathematics, stopped passing down the understanding? And where did it come from in the first place? The Greeks didn't write about devices like this. There are no instruction manuals, no descriptions, no records of a tradition of mechanical astronomy. The Antikythera mechanism appears fully formed, astonishingly sophisticated, and utterly alone. Unless it wasn't the beginning, unless it was the end, the last remnant of a knowledge system that was already ancient when the Greeks inherited it. Look at the human genome. Look at what it remembers. Around 70,000 years ago, something happened. The human population crashed. Genetic analysis suggests we dropped to perhaps 10,000 individuals, maybe fewer. A bottleneck so severe that all humans alive today descend from that tiny surviving population. We call it the Toba catastrophe, after a supervolcanic eruption in Indonesia that may have triggered a volcanic winter lasting years. The sky darkened, temperatures plummeted, ecosystems collapsed, and humanity nearly went extinct. But we didn't. Somehow, somewhere, a few thousand people survived, and when the skies cleared and the world warmed, they spread out again, repopulating the planet, carrying with them the genetic memory of near annihilation. What else did they carry? What knowledge, what skills, what understanding did those survivors possess? If a civilization existed before Toba, it would have been erased. Not just its buildings and cities, but its people, its culture, its continuity. Only fragments would remain, survivors scattered across the world, carrying whatever they could remember, whatever they could preserve. And maybe that's what we see in the archaeological record, not the slow, linear development of primitive humans gradually inventing agriculture and architecture, but the recovery, the rebuilding, the attempt to reconstruct what was lost. Maybe the sudden appearance of agriculture in multiple locations around 10,000 BCE wasn't invention. Maybe it was remembering. In Michigan's Upper Peninsula, ancient mines honeycomb the landscape, thousands of them, pits and trenches where someone long ago extracted copper from the rock. How much copper? Estimates suggest £500 million, maybe more. Extracted over thousands of years, beginning around 5000 BCE and continuing until roughly 1200 BCE. Then the mining stopped, abruptly, completely. Where did the copper go? Who mined it? The indigenous peoples of the region have no tradition of large-scale copper mining, no oral histories of the work, no cultural memory of the operation. The copper simply vanished into history. £500 million of metal extracted with enormous labour transported somewhere, used for something, but what and by whom? In Europe, the Bronze Age required copper, vast amounts of it, but the sources for all that copper remain unclear. Could some of it have come from Michigan? Could ancient mariners have crossed the Atlantic thousands of years before Columbus, trading for copper, establishing routes that were later forgotten? The conventional answer is no. The Atlantic was an impassable barrier. Ancient peoples lacked the ships, the navigation, the capability, but did they? In Turkey, at Göbekli Tepe, we've already seen the impossible, but Göbekli Tepe isn't alone. In Indonesia, Gunung Padang rises from the jungle, a terraced hill that may be the largest megalithic structure in Southeast Asia. Ground-penetrating radar and core samples suggest that beneath the surface layers lie older structures, possibly chambers and passages, dating back 10,000 years or more. In Russia, the Shigia idol, a wooden sculpture carved from larch, dates to around 11,000 years ago, making it twice as old as the pyramids and older than Stonehenge. Its surface is covered with geometric patterns and symbols that may represent the oldest known example of encoded information. In Brazil, in the Amazon, LIDAR surveys have revealed vast earthworks, geometric shapes, ditches, mounds, hidden beneath the rainforest canopy. Some of these structures date back thousands of years, built by cultures we know almost nothing about, then swallowed by the jungle and forgotten. The megaliths aren't confined to Egypt and Peru. They're everywhere, on every continent, built by cultures separated by oceans and millennia, yet sharing techniques, proportions, astronomical alignments. Why? How? The standard explanation is convergent evolution, different cultures independently developing similar solutions to similar problems. But at what point does convergence become implausible? At what point do we have to consider transmission, contact, shared knowledge? In Iraq in 1936, archaeologists discovered a clay jar containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod. When filled with an acidic liquid, vinegar, wine, citrus juice, the jar produces a small electrical current. We call it the Baghdad battery, and we don't know what to make of it. The conventional interpretation is that it was used for electroplating, coating objects with a thin layer of gold or silver, but that's speculation. We don't actually know what it was for. What we do know is that it works. It generates electricity, and it dates to around 200 BCE, though some researchers suggest it may be older. One battery doesn't prove ancient electrical knowledge, but it raises questions. If they could build one, could they build more? Could they wire them in series, increase the voltage, power something larger? In Egypt, in the Temple of Dendera, there's a relief that some researchers interpret as depicting a large light bulb, a lotus flower containing a serpent, connected by a cable to a box. Egyptologists dismiss this as symbolic, mythological, but the resemblance to a Crookes tube, an early electrical discharge lamp, is striking. Could the Egyptians have had electric light? Could they have illuminated the deep interior chambers of their temples without torches, without soot, without smoke? The chambers are there, the walls are clean, and the reliefs remain, ambiguous and provocative, suggesting possibilities we're not ready to accept. The Maya calculated time with obsessive precision. Their long count calendar tracked days from a mythical starting point in 3114 BCE, and their astronomical tables predicted planetary movements, eclipses, and celestial events with accuracy that rivals modern calculations. They knew the length of the solar year to within seconds. They tracked Venus with precision that wouldn't be matched in Europe until the invention of the telescope. They understood the precession of the equinoxes, a cycle that takes 26,000 years to complete. How? Why? The conventional answer is observation. Centuries of patient sky watching, recording, calculating. But that assumes continuity, an unbroken tradition of astronomical observation stretching back generations. What if the tradition wasn't unbroken? What if the Maya inherited their astronomical knowledge from an earlier source, preserved it, refined it, but didn't originate it? The same question applies to the Egyptians, who aligned the pyramids to true north with an accuracy of 3/60th of a single degree. To the builders of Stonehenge, who oriented the monument to the summer solstice sunrise. To the ancestral Puebloans, who built structures aligned to solar and lunar cycles. Astronomy isn't just observation, it's mathematics, it's geometry. It's an understanding of cycles and patterns that requires not just watching the sky, but comprehending what you're watching. And maybe that comprehension came from somewhere older. Maybe the knowledge was passed down, preserved in stone and calendar and myth, waiting for cultures capable of understanding it. Wheat didn't domesticate itself. Neither did rice or corn or barley. Domestication is a process. It requires selection, cultivation, patience. Wild wheat has seeds that shatter and scatter when ripe, a survival mechanism that ensures propagation. Domesticated wheat has seeds that stay on the stalk, making harvest possible but requiring human intervention to plant the next generation. That change doesn't happen by accident. It requires someone to recognize the desirable trait, select for it, cultivate it over generations until the plant becomes dependent on human agriculture. The same is true for animals. Wild cattle are aggressive, dangerous. Domesticated cattle are docile, manageable. That transformation requires selective breeding over many generations, a deliberate process guided by knowledge and intention. And yet, around 10,000 BCE, in multiple locations around the world, agriculture appears. Not gradually, not experimentally, but suddenly and fully formed. Wheat in the Fertile Crescent, rice in China, corn in Mesoamerica, potatoes in the Andes, different crops, different continents, different peoples, but the same knowledge, the understanding of domestication, of selective breeding, of agriculture itself. Convergent evolution, or shared knowledge? And if shared, from where? From whom? The Polynesians navigated thousands of miles of open ocean without instruments, without maps, without compasses. They read the stars, the waves, the birds, the clouds. They understood currents and swells, could detect islands beyond the horizon by the way the ocean moved. This wasn't primitive guesswork. It was sophisticated navigation, a knowledge system as complex as any modern technique, passed down through oral tradition and practical training. They settled Hawaii, Easter Island, New Zealand, islands separated by vast distances, requiring voyages of weeks or months across empty ocean. And they did it in outrigger canoes, vessels that seem impossibly fragile for such journeys. But they made it, again and again, deliberately, successfully. If the Polynesians could cross the Pacific, why couldn't others cross the Atlantic? Why couldn't ancient mariners have sailed from Africa to South America, from the Mediterranean to the Americas, from Asia to the Pacific coast? We assume they couldn't because we have no records of such voyages. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Ships rot. Logs are lost. oral traditions fade. What remains are the anomalies: cocaine and tobacco in Egyptian mummies, plants native to the Americas, chickens in South America before Columbus, birds that originated in Asia, genetic markers in indigenous populations that suggest contact, mixing, exchange. Maybe the oceans weren't barriers, maybe they were highways, and maybe the knowledge of navigation, of shipbuilding, of reading the sea and sky was older and more widespread than we imagine. Trepanation, the practice of drilling or scraping a hole in the skull, is one of the oldest surgical procedures in human history. Skulls with trepanation holes have been found on every continent, dating back thousands of years, and many of them show signs of healing. The bone regrew around the hole, meaning the patient survived the procedure, lived for months or years afterward. This wasn't butchery, this was surgery. Deliberate, skilled, successful. Why did they do it? The conventional explanation is that it was a treatment for head injuries, a way to relieve pressure from skull fractures or bleeding. But some skulls show multiple trepanations performed at different times, suggesting repeated procedures for chronic conditions. Others show no signs of injury at all. The trepanation was performed on healthy bone for reasons we can only guess at. Ritual, medical, psychological. What we know is that ancient surgeons possessed knowledge of anatomy, of infection control, of patient care. They understood that the skull could be opened without killing the patient, that the brain could be exposed and the person could survive. That's not primitive medicine. That's sophisticated surgical knowledge, passed down through training and tradition, refined over generations, and it appears everywhere, in Peru, in France, in Russia, in Africa. Different cultures, different time periods, but the same procedure, the same knowledge. How did it spread? Or did it originate from a common source, a shared understanding of human anatomy and surgical technique that predates recorded history? The mystery schools of the ancient world, the Eleusinian mysteries, the Pythagorean brotherhood, the Egyptian priesthoods, guarded knowledge, secret knowledge, sacred knowledge. They taught through initiation, through ritual, through symbolic instruction. The knowledge wasn't written down, wasn't made public. It was transmitted orally, experientially, from teacher to student, generation to generation. What were they preserving? What did they know? Pythagoras taught mathematics, geometry, music theory, but also cosmology, metaphysics, the nature of reality. His followers believed that numbers were the fundamental structure of the universe, that geometry revealed divine truth. The Eleusinian mysteries promised initiates a vision of the afterlife, a direct experience of the sacred. Participants described it as life-changing, transformative, but they were forbidden to speak of what they witnessed. The Egyptian priesthoods controlled access to the temples, to the rituals, to the knowledge encoded in hieroglyphs and symbols. They were astronomers, mathematicians, physicians, architects, but also mystics, guardians of traditions that stretched back to the time of the gods. What if these mystery schools weren't inventing knowledge, but preserving it? What if they were the custodians of an older wisdom, fragments of understanding salvaged from a lost world, kept alive through secrecy and ritual? And what if that knowledge is still preserved, still hidden, still waiting in the symbols and ceremonies of esoteric traditions that continue to this day? The Aboriginal Australians have oral traditions that describe the landscape as it was 10,000 years ago. They tell stories of when the sea level was lower, when you could walk to islands that are now submerged, when rivers flowed in different directions. Geologists have confirmed these stories. The landscape did look that way 10,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age. The stories survived for 400 generations, passed down orally, without writing, without external records, preserving accurate geographical information across a span of time that encompasses the entire rise of civilization. If oral tradition can preserve geography for 10,000 years, what else can it preserve? Technical knowledge, astronomical data, historical events. The Vedas, the sacred texts of Hinduism, were transmitted orally for thousands of years before being written down. The precision of the transmission was so exact that scholars can identify regional variations in pronunciation that date back millennia. The Polynesian navigators learned their craft through oral instruction, memorizing star paths, wave patterns, island locations. The knowledge was encoded in chants, in stories, in practical demonstration. Maybe the myths aren't just stories. Maybe they're mnemonic devices, encoding real information in narrative form, preserving knowledge through metaphor and symbol. Maybe the flood myths aren't just cultural memories of local disasters. Maybe they're describing something real, a global cataclysm that ended a world and forced the survivors to preserve what they could in the only medium that would survive: story. The Indo-European language family spans from Iceland to India, from Ireland to Iran. Hundreds of languages spoken by billions of people, all descended from a common ancestor. We call it Proto-Indo-European. We've reconstructed it through comparative linguistics, tracing the evolution of words and grammar back through time, and we've determined that it was spoken somewhere around 4000 BCE, possibly on the steppes of Central Asia. But how did it spread so far, so fast? How did a single language become the ancestor of Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, Germanic, Celtic, Slavic, and dozens of other language families? The conventional answer is migration. Waves of people moving out from a homeland, carrying their language with them, displacing or assimilating the populations they encountered. But that's a violent, disruptive process. And it doesn't fully explain the linguistic similarities, the shared vocabulary, the common roots that appear in languages separated by thousands of miles. What if the spread wasn't just migration? What if it was transmission? The deliberate sharing of knowledge, of culture, of language by people who travelled, who traded, who taught? And what if Proto-Indo-European itself wasn't the beginning, but a descendant of something older? A language spoken by a people who left no written records, but whose words survived in the languages of their successors. From the air, the Nazca lines are unmistakable. Geometric shapes, animal figures, straight lines that run for miles across the desert plateau of southern Peru. From the ground, they're almost invisible, shallow trenches a few inches deep, revealing lighter coloured soil beneath the darker surface. You can walk across them without noticing, but from above, they're clear, precise, deliberate. Why? For whom? The conventional explanation is that they were ritual pathways, ceremonial lines walked by the Nazca people as part of religious practices. But that doesn't explain the scale, the precision, the effort required to create lines that can only be fully appreciated from the air. Some researchers suggest they're astronomical markers, aligned to solstices and equinoxes. Others propose they're related to water, pointing toward underground aquifers in a desert landscape where water was precious. But none of these explanations fully satisfy. The Nazca lines remain enigmatic, a massive engineering project whose purpose we can only guess at. And they're not alone. In Kazakhstan, earthworks visible only from the air form geometric patterns, circles, crosses, squares, dating back thousands of years. In the Amazon, geoglyphs hidden beneath the rainforest canopy suggest large-scale landscape engineering by pre-Columbian cultures. Who were they signalling? What were they marking? Or were they creating something else? A form of art, of expression, of communication that we don't understand because we're not the intended audience. The Parthenon in Athens embodies the golden ratio. The proportions of the facade, the spacing of the columns, the dimensions of the interior, all reflect mathematical relationships that create a sense of harmony, of balance, of aesthetic perfection. The Great Pyramid encodes pi and phi in its dimensions. The ratio of the perimeters to the height approximates 2p. The ratio of the slant height to half the base approximates f, the golden ratio. Coincidence or design? Sacred geometry appears in temples, cathedrals, mosques, monuments around the world. The same proportions, the same ratios, the same mathematical relationships that create beauty, that resonate with human perception, that feel right in ways we can't fully articulate. The architects of these structures understood something. They knew that certain proportions create harmony, that mathematics and aesthetics are connected, that geometry can encode meaning. But where did that knowledge come from? How did builders separated by centuries and continents arrive at the same mathematical principles? Maybe they didn't arrive at them. Maybe they inherited them. Maybe sacred geometry is a fragment of an older knowledge system, a mathematical understanding of proportion and harmony that was passed down through architectural traditions, preserved in the dimensions of sacred spaces. And maybe when we stand in these spaces, when we feel that sense of awe and rightness, we're responding to something deeper than aesthetics. We're recognizing a language of form and number that speaks to something fundamental in human consciousness. Cataclysm resets the clock. It erases the accumulated complexity of civilization and forces the survivors to start over. The Younger Dryas, a period of rapid cooling that began around 10,800 BCE, may have been triggered by a cosmic impact, a comet or asteroid that struck the ice sheets covering North America, causing massive flooding, climate disruption, and ecological collapse. The evidence is controversial, debated, but mounting. A layer of sediment dating to the Younger Dryas contains high concentrations of platinum, nanodiamonds, and other markers consistent with an extraterrestrial impact. Across North America, a black matte layer of sediment marks a sudden die-off of megafauna and a disruption of human cultures. If the impact happened, it would have been catastrophic. Tsunamis, wildfires, a return to Ice Age conditions lasting more than 1,000 years. Any civilization existing at that time would have been devastated. Cities flooded, populations scattered, knowledge lost. And when the climate stabilized, when the survivors emerged and began to rebuild, they would have started from fragments, from memories, from whatever they could salvage of the world that was. Maybe that's what we see at Göbekli Tepe, not the beginning of civilization, but the aftermath, the attempt to preserve, to remember, to rebuild what was lost. And maybe the flood myths aren't myths at all. Maybe their history, the collective memory of a world that drowned, of a cataclysm that ended an age and forced humanity to begin again. What will we leave behind? If our civilization ended tomorrow, if a pandemic, a war, a climate catastrophe, a cosmic impact reset the world, what would survive? Our cities would crumble. Concrete and steel corrode, collapse, return to Earth within centuries. Our books would rot. Our digital records would degrade. Our satellites would fall from orbit. Within 1,000 years, most of what we've built would be gone. Within 10,000 years, almost all traces of our existence would be erased. What would remain? Stone. The pyramids, perhaps. Mount Rushmore. The Georgia Guidestones until they were demolished. Anything carved from granite or basalt. Anything massive enough to resist erosion. And maybe some artifacts. Stainless steel might survive. Ceramics, glass, anything buried deep enough, preserved by chance in the right conditions. But our knowledge, our science, our technology, our understanding of the world, that would vanish unless we encoded it, unless we carved it into stone, built it into monuments, embedded it in structures that would outlast the collapse, unless we did what the first civilization may have done. Preserved what we could, passed it down, hoped that someone, someday, would find it and understand. And maybe that's what we're looking at. Not the primitive scratchings of ancient peoples, but the desperate legacy of a civilization that knew it was ending, that tried to save what it could, that left clues in stone and symbol and story, hoping that we would be wise enough to recognize them. The clues are everywhere, in the precision of the stones, in the knowledge encoded in myths, in the astronomical alignments and the acoustic properties and the mathematical proportions. They're in the genetic bottlenecks and the domesticated plants and the ancient mines, in the surgical techniques and the navigational knowledge and the mystery schools. They're in the languages we speak and the symbols we use and the structures we build. We walk past them, we stand on them, we live within them. And maybe we always have. Maybe we're not the first civilization to rise on this planet. Maybe we're the latest, the inheritors of a legacy we don't fully understand. Building on foundations we didn't lay, speaking languages descended from tongues we never heard. Maybe the first civilization didn't leave us ruins. Maybe they left us knowledge, encoded, fragmented, scattered across the world in forms we're only beginning to recognize. And maybe the greatest mystery isn't whether they existed, it's whether we'll understand what they were trying to tell us before we, too, become a mystery for the civilizations that come after. Because the cycle continues. Civilizations rise, they grow, they achieve wonders, and then they fall. The climate changes, the resources run out, the catastrophe comes, and the survivors carry what they can into the next age. The knowledge, the stories, the fragments of understanding that might help the next civilization avoid the same mistakes, reach the same heights. Remember what was lost. We are those survivors. We've always been those survivors. And the clues we're finding aren't from strangers. They're from us. From who we were. From who we might become again. If we remember. If we listen. If we're willing to see that the past isn't behind us, it's beneath us, around us, within us, waiting. In 1994, 3 cave explorers in southern France squeezed through a narrow passage and emerged into a cathedral of stone. The beam of their flashlights swept across the walls and they froze. Animals, hundreds of them. Horses, lions, rhinoceroses, mammoths, bears, rendered in charcoal and ochre with such skill, such mastery, such impossible grace, that they seemed to move in the flickering light. The Chauvet Cave, sealed for millennia by a rockfall, preserved in darkness, untouched since the artists left their handprints on the walls and walked back into the Ice Age world. When the paintings were dated, the results shocked the archaeological community. 32,000 years old, some possibly older, created at a time when, according to the standard narrative, humans were supposed to be primitive hunter-gatherers, barely capable of abstract thought, still tens of thousands of years away from anything we'd recognise as civilization. But the art on those walls isn't primitive. It's masterful. It shows perspective, shading, the illusion of movement. The artists used the natural contours of the rock to give their animals three-dimensional form. They understood anatomy, proportion, the play of light and shadow. They mixed pigments with a sophistication that rivals modern chemistry. This wasn't the work of people learning to draw. This was the work of masters. And here's the problem. There's nothing before it. No crude attempts, no gradual development, no evolutionary progression from stick figures to masterpieces. The art appears fully formed. We expect evolution. We expect progress. We expect to see the fumbling first attempts, the slow refinement of technique, the gradual accumulation of skill over generations. That's how it's supposed to work. That's how everything works. You crawl before you walk before you run. But in Chauvet, we see running. We see artists who understood their craft so completely, so intuitively, that they could render a charging rhinoceros with 4 legs to show motion, could capture the weight and power of a cave lion with a few strokes of charcoal, could make stone walls breathe with life. Where did they learn? Who taught them? Where are the practice sketches, the failed attempts, the learning curve? They don't exist, or if they do, we haven't found them. What we find instead is mastery, sudden, complete. As if the knowledge didn't develop, it arrived. And it's not just Chauvet. In caves across Europe we find the same pattern. Art that appears without precedent, without the expected progression from simple to complex. Lascaux in France, Altamira in Spain, caves in Italy, Germany, Romania. Each one a gallery of sophisticated imagery, each one created by artists who understood their medium completely. The conventional explanation is that the earlier, cruder art existed but hasn't survived, that the learning process happened on perishable materials, wood, hide, sand, and only the masterpieces on stone walls endured. Maybe that's possible, that's reasonable, but what if it's not true? What if the art appears fully formed because it was taught, transmitted, passed down from a tradition that was already ancient when these caves were painted? What if these artists weren't inventing art? What if they were remembering it? Consider the locations, not the caves themselves, but where the art appears within them. Deep, impossibly deep. Past narrow passages and vertical shafts, through chambers that require crawling on your belly in absolute darkness, into spaces that take hours to reach even with modern equipment. Why? Why go so far? Why risk your life squeezing through gaps in the rock, navigating underground rivers, climbing down into the earth's throat to paint where no one would see? Because maybe someone was meant to see. Not humans, not the casual observer. Something else. Something that required the journey, the ordeal, the descent into darkness. The caves weren't galleries. They were temples, initiation chambers, places where the boundary between worlds grew thin, and the art wasn't decoration, it was instruction, documentation, a record of knowledge that could only be accessed in altered states, in the deep places, in the darkness where the veil lifts. Look at the handprints, they're everywhere. Scattered among the animals, pressed against the stone in red and black ochre. Positive prints where the hand was painted. Negative prints where pigment was blown around the hand, leaving a ghostly silhouette. We call them signatures, personal marks. I was here. But what if they're more than that? What if they're messages? Markers? A way of saying, this knowledge is real. I touched it. I witnessed it. I'm leaving proof. Some of the handprints are missing fingers, not from injury. The stumps are too clean, too deliberate. Ritual amputation, perhaps. Or a symbolic gesture, fingers bent back while the pigment was applied. A code, a language of hands, a way of marking different types of knowledge, different levels of initiation, different messages for those who came after. We see the prints, we photograph them, we marvel at the connection across millennia. A human hand, just like ours, pressed against stone 30,000 years ago. But we don't read them. We don't understand what they're saying. Not yet. And then there are the geometric patterns. The dots, grids, spirals, zigzags. The abstract symbols that appear alongside the animals, sometimes overlapping them, sometimes standing alone. For decades, archaeologists dismissed them as decoration. Filler. Random marks with no particular meaning. But they're not random. They're consistent. The same symbols appear in caves, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. In Europe, Africa, Australia, the Americas. Cultures that supposedly never had contact, never shared knowledge, never communicated across the vast distances that separated them. Yet they drew the same symbols, over and over, as if they meant something, as if they were recording something universal. Recent research suggests these geometric patterns might be entoptic phenomena, images generated by the human nervous system during altered states of consciousness. When you fast, when you meditate, when you enter trance, when you take psychoactive substances, your brain produces these patterns, spirals, grids, dots, zigzags. Everyone sees them, across all cultures, across all time, because they're hardwired into our neurology. So maybe the cave artists were recording what they saw in trance states, mapping the inner landscape, documenting the journey into altered consciousness. Or maybe, and this is where it gets interesting, maybe they were using these symbols as a key, a way of triggering those states, a visual language that could unlock the doors of perception, allowing others to access the same knowledge, the same visions, the same understanding, a technology of consciousness, encoded in stone. In northern Australia, in the Kimberley region, there are caves with paintings that might be 50,000 years old, maybe older. The dating is controversial, the methods debated, but the art itself is undeniable. Wandjina figures, beings with large eyes, no mouths, radiating headdresses, spirit ancestors according to Aboriginal tradition, sky beings who came in the dream time, who taught the people, who left their images on the rock as a reminder. The Aboriginal people say they didn't create these images. They say they maintain them, repaint them, keep them alive. But the original artists were the Wandjina themselves, a story, a myth, a way of explaining the inexplicable, or a memory, a record of contact, a description of teachers who came from somewhere else, who brought knowledge, who left their mark and departed. We can't know. The line between myth and history blurs the further back we go, but the art remains, and the tradition of maintaining it, of keeping the knowledge alive, stretches back into a past we can barely imagine. In the caves of Spain, in Altamira, there are bison painted on the ceiling with such anatomical precision that zoologists can identify the species, the sex, the age. The artist understood animal behavior, migration patterns, seasonal changes. They knew which animals appeared when, where they gathered, how they moved. This wasn't casual observation. This was systematic knowledge. The kind of understanding that takes generations to accumulate, that requires careful study, that demands a framework for organizing and transmitting information. In other words, science. Not modern science, not the scientific method as we know it, but a rigorous approach to understanding the natural world. A body of knowledge passed down through teaching, through initiation, through the careful preservation of accumulated wisdom. And maybe that's what the caves were for. Not art galleries, not religious shrines, but schools, libraries, places where knowledge was stored in the most permanent medium available, stone, and where initiates came to learn, to memorize, to carry the information forward into the next generation. The animals weren't just pictures, they were textbooks, encyclopedias, databases of ecological knowledge encoded in imagery that could survive for millennia. But here's what haunts me. The art stops. Around 10,000 years ago, give or take, the tradition dies. The caves fall silent. The artists stop coming, stop painting, stop maintaining the images. Why? What happened? The standard explanation is that the Ice Age ended. The climate warmed. The megafauna died out or migrated. The cultures that created the art adapted to new conditions, developed new traditions, moved on. But what if it's more than that? What if the art stopped because the knowledge was lost? Because the catastrophe came. The floods, the climate chaos, the collapse. And the survivors couldn't maintain the tradition, couldn't remember the teachings, couldn't access the altered states that made the knowledge available. What if the cave art represents the end of something, not the beginning? The last gasp of a sophisticated tradition that was already dying, already fragmenting, already slipping away into the darkness. And what if the artist knew it? What if they went deep into the caves, into the most remote and protected chambers, and left their masterpieces there as a time capsule, a message to whoever came after, a record of what was known, what was understood, what was about to be lost? There's a cave in France called Ufignac, 5 miles of passages winding deep into the earth. On the ceilings, mammoths, dozens of them, rendered with such skill that you can see the texture of their fur, the weight of their tusks, the intelligence in their eyes. To paint them, the artists had to lie on their backs on scaffolding, working by the light of animal fat lamps, in chambers so remote that the journey there and back would have taken hours. Why? Why go to such extraordinary lengths? Why risk your life in the darkness to paint where almost no one would ever see? Unless the seeing wasn't the point. Unless the act itself was the point. The journey, the ordeal, the descent into the underworld and the return with knowledge. The paintings weren't meant to be viewed. They were meant to be created. The process was the teaching. The journey was the initiation. And maybe that's what we've lost. Not just the art, but the understanding of what the art was for. Not decoration, not self-expression, not even communication in the way we understand it, but transformation, a technology for changing consciousness, for accessing knowledge that couldn't be transmitted through words alone. In the caves of Sulawesi, Indonesia, there are handprints and animal paintings that date back nearly 40,000 years. On the other side of the world from Europe, separated by oceans and continents and thousands of miles of distance, yet the techniques are similar, the pigments are similar, the choice of subjects, hands, animals, geometric patterns is similar. Coincidence? Parallel development. The inevitable result of human creativity expressing itself in similar ways across different cultures. Maybe that's the conventional explanation. That's what we're supposed to believe. But what if it's not coincidence? What if it's memory? What if these widely separated cultures were drawing on the same source, the same tradition, the same body of knowledge that had been passed down from a time before the separation, before the distances became impassable, before the world was divided into isolated pockets of humanity? What if the similarity isn't because humans naturally create similar art? What if it's because they were all taught by the same teachers? Consider the pigments. We think of cave art as primitive, but the chemistry involved is anything but simple. The artists mixed minerals, ochre, hematite, manganese dioxide, with binders like animal fat, blood, or plant resins. They understood which combinations would adhere to stone, which would resist moisture, which would maintain their colour for millennia. They created different shades by heating the minerals to specific temperatures. They knew that yellow ochre becomes red when heated, that the intensity of the colour depends on the duration and heat of the fire. They made brushes from animal hair, hollow bones for blowing pigment, palettes for mixing. They understood the properties of different surfaces, how to prepare the stone, how to make the paint flow or stick as needed. This is sophisticated knowledge. This is chemistry, practical, applied, refined over time through experimentation and careful observation. Where did it come from? How did they learn it? How did they pass it on? And why, if this knowledge was so important, so carefully developed, did it disappear? Why did later cultures have to rediscover these techniques, reinvent these processes, relearn what had already been known? In the caves, there are images that don't fit our categories, beings that are part human, part animal. Therianthropes, we call them, shapeshifters, shamanic figures, a human body with a bison head, a bird-headed figure with human hands, a being that's half lion, half man. We interpret them as shamans in trance, wearing animal masks, embodying the spirits of the creatures they hunted, symbolic representations of spiritual transformation. But what if they're more literal than that? What if they're records of something seen, something experienced, something encountered in the deep places where consciousness shifts and the boundaries between categories dissolve? What if the artists were documenting a reality that we've forgotten how to access? A state of being where the separation between human and animal, between self and other, between inner and outer, becomes fluid. The shamanic interpretation makes sense. It fits with what we know about hunter-gatherer spirituality, about the use of altered states, about the role of ritual specialists in traditional societies. But maybe shamanism itself is a remnant, a fragment of a more sophisticated system, a way of accessing knowledge that was once more widely understood, more systematically practiced, more central to human culture. Maybe the shamans are the survivors, the ones who kept the techniques alive after the system collapsed, the ones who remembered even if they no longer understood the full context of what they were remembering. There are caves now underwater, submerged by rising seas at the end of the Ice Age, flooded chambers that once held paintings, carvings, evidence of human presence. We found some of them. Divers exploring underwater caves in the Mediterranean, off the coast of France, in the cenotes of Mexico. They've discovered art in chambers that have been underwater for 10,000 years or more. How much more is down there? How many caves were flooded before anyone could document what they contained? How much knowledge was lost when the seas rose and the coastlines shifted and the world was drowned? The Ice Age world had more land. The sea levels were lower. The coastlines extended miles beyond where they are now. And humans, like all animals, prefer to live near water, near the coasts, near the rivers and lakes and shores, which means the majority of Ice Age human sites are now underwater, inaccessible, invisible, lost beneath hundreds of feet of ocean. We're looking at the remnants, the inland sites, the caves that happened to be high enough to escape the floods, the fragments that survived. But the full picture, the complete record, it's drowned. And with it, who knows what evidence of sophistication, of knowledge, of cultural complexity that would challenge everything we think we know about the past. In the caves of Lascaux, there's a chamber called the Shaft of the Dead Man. To reach it, you have to descend a vertical shaft, a dangerous climb even with modern equipment. At the bottom there's a painting, a man with a bird head falling backward, a bison wounded, its entrails spilling out, a bird on a stick, a rhinoceros walking away. It's one of the most enigmatic images in all of cave art. Archaeologists have debated its meaning for decades. A hunting accident, a shamanic vision, a mythological scene. No one knows. The context is lost. The story is lost. All we have is the image, painted in a place so remote, so difficult to access that it's clear the artist wanted it hidden, protected, preserved for those who would make the journey, a secret, a mystery, a piece of knowledge encoded in imagery that we can see but not understand. And maybe that's the point. Maybe some knowledge can't be transmitted directly. Maybe it has to be earned, sought, discovered through the same kind of ordeal that the original artists underwent. Maybe the caves aren't meant to give us answers. Maybe they're meant to give us questions, to make us descend into the darkness, to make us confront the mystery, to make us realize how much we don't know. The conventional timeline says that symbolic thought, the ability to create and understand abstract representations, emerged suddenly around 40,000 years ago. The Upper Paleolithic Revolution, they call it. A cognitive leap, a rewiring of the human brain that gave us language, art, culture, everything that makes us distinctly human. Before that, nothing, or almost nothing. Simple tools, basic survival, no evidence of abstract thinking, of symbolic expression, of anything we'd recognize as culture. And then suddenly, art. Sophisticated, masterful, fully formed. It's a neat story. It fits with the idea of human progress, of evolution, of gradual development from primitive to advanced. But it's also suspicious. Evolution doesn't work in leaps. Brains don't rewire themselves overnight. Cognitive abilities don't appear out of nowhere. So what if the timeline is wrong? What if symbolic thought is much older than we think? What if the evidence exists but we haven't found it, or haven't recognized it, or it didn't survive? What if the revolution wasn't the beginning of symbolic thought? What if it was a resurgence, a rediscovery? A moment when survivors of an earlier collapse managed to recover and transmit fragments of knowledge that had been lost? There's a pattern in the caves. The same animals appear over and over: horses, bison, aurochs, mammoths, deer, lions, bears. But not all animals, not the ones the people actually ate most often, not the small game, the birds, the fish that made up the bulk of their diet. They painted the powerful animals, the dangerous ones, the ones that required skill and courage to hunt, the ones that could kill you. Why? What were they recording? What were they teaching? Maybe it's about respect, about honoring the animals that gave their lives, about maintaining the relationship between hunter and hunted. Or maybe it's about knowledge, about understanding the behavior of the most challenging prey, about passing down the techniques, the strategies, the accumulated wisdom of successful hunters. Or maybe it's about something else entirely. Maybe the animals are symbols, representations of forces, principles, concepts that we no longer understand, a language of imagery that carried meaning beyond the literal. We see horses. They saw something more, something we've forgotten how to read. In the Bradshaw paintings of Australia, there are figures in elaborate costumes, carrying tools and weapons, engaged in ceremonies and dances. The style is so different from later Aboriginal art that, when they were first discovered, European archaeologists assumed they must have been created by a different culture. A lost civilization, a people who vanished without a trace. The Aboriginal people said no, these are our ancestors, this is our art. We know the stories, we maintain the tradition, but the paintings are old, possibly 20,000 years or more, and the style did change. The elaborate figures gave way to simpler forms, the detail was lost, the tradition evolved, or devolved, into something different. What happened? Why did the style change? Why did the sophistication decrease? Maybe it's just artistic evolution. Styles change, preferences shift. What one generation values, the next abandons. Or maybe it's loss. Maybe the knowledge of how to create those elaborate figures was forgotten. Maybe the meaning behind them was lost. Maybe the tradition fragmented, and later generations could only approximate what their ancestors had achieved. A decline, a forgetting, a slow erosion of knowledge over time. The caves are dark, completely, absolutely dark. Without light, you can't see your hand in front of your face. You can't navigate. You can't paint. So the artist brought light. Animal fat lamps, torches, flickering, unreliable, casting moving shadows on the walls, and in that flickering light the animals move, the shadows shift, the contours of the rock create the illusions of three-dimensional form. A horse seems to gallop, a bison seems to charge. The artist understood this, they used it. They placed their images where the natural movement of light and shadow would bring them to life. This is sophisticated understanding. This is knowledge of perception, of psychology, of how the human brain interprets visual information. This is art that's designed not just to be seen, but to be experienced, to create an altered state, to blur the line between image and reality. In the darkness, with the lamp flames dancing, with the smoke and the cold and the isolation, the walls would have seemed alive, The animals would have seemed real. The boundary between the painted world and the physical world would have dissolved. And maybe that was the point. Maybe the caves were machines for altering consciousness, for creating experiences that couldn't be achieved in the daylight world, for accessing knowledge that required a different state of mind. We've found evidence of sound in the caves. Acoustic studies show that the chambers with the most art are also the chambers with the best resonance. Places where sound echoes, amplifies, create strange effects. Singing in these chambers would have been a powerful experience. Drumming, chanting. The sound would have filled the space, reverberated off the walls, created harmonics and overtones that don't exist in the open air. And maybe that was part of the ritual. Maybe the art wasn't meant to be viewed in silence. Maybe it was meant to be activated by sound, by rhythm, by the human voice raised in song or prayer or invocation. A multi-sensory experience. Sight and sound and darkness and isolation all working together to create a state of consciousness where knowledge could be transmitted, where visions could be accessed, where the boundary between worlds could be crossed. We see the art, we photograph it, we analyze the pigments and the techniques and the subject matter, but we don't hear it. We don't experience it the way it was meant to be experienced. We don't activate it. We're looking at the hardware without the software, the medium without the message, and maybe that's the real loss, not the art itself. We have that, preserved in stone, waiting for us to find it, but the context, the understanding, the knowledge of what the art was for, how it was used, what it was meant to do. We've inherited the tools without the instruction manual, the technology without the training, the fragments without the framework that would make them comprehensible. The cave artists left us their masterpieces, but they couldn't leave us the experience of creating them. The journey into the darkness, the altered states, the visions, the knowledge that came through the process, not from the product. That's what's lost. That's what we're trying to recover, not just the art, but the way of seeing that made the art possible, the way of knowing that the art was meant to transmit, because maybe the art isn't the knowledge. Maybe the art is the key, the trigger, the doorway. Maybe the real knowledge is still there, waiting in the darkness, accessible to anyone willing to make the journey, to descend into the caves, to sit in the silence, to open themselves to whatever the artists were trying to transmit. Maybe we're not supposed to understand the art by looking at it. Maybe we're supposed to understand it by doing what the artist did, by going where they went, by seeing what they saw. Maybe the knowledge isn't in the images. Maybe it's in the experience of encountering them, in the right place, in the right state, with the right preparation. Maybe the caves are still teaching, still transmitting, still offering their secrets to those who know how to listen. We just have to remember how, and perhaps that's what all of this is about. Not proving that an ancient civilization existed, not finding definitive evidence of lost knowledge, not solving the mystery once and for all, but remembering, reconnecting, recognizing that the past isn't a foreign country. It's our country, our heritage, our legacy. The people who painted those caves weren't primitive. They weren't less intelligent, less capable, less human than we are. They were us. They had the same brains, the same potential, the same capacity for abstract thought and symbolic expression and sophisticated understanding. They knew things. They understood things. They had developed ways of seeing and knowing and being that we've lost, and they left us clues, not in words. Words fade, languages die, meanings shift, but in images, in stone, in places that would endure long after they were gone. They left us the caves, and the art, and the mystery, waiting for us to remember, waiting for us to understand, waiting for us to realize that the knowledge isn't lost, it's just forgotten, and anything forgotten can be remembered again.